Managing your system and your team is one of what I think is the most challenging things we as designers will be responsible for. It's really, sometimes it's not in our normal comfort zones to manage and organize things that can get really big and have a lot of weight and behind them. There's always the famous joke of last file dot last latest final version dot png, right, or dot psd, the old Photoshop file. But I feel once we've got our grasp on managing these systems, it's not only like a rewarding process, but only help with the productivity, but also increase the overall effectiveness of ourselves and our teams. Once again, my name is Billy Sweetman, husband, dad of 2 daughters, design lead here at Headway. I've been doing design work for about 12 years. I've had experience building design systems for startups and large enterprise apps. Design systems and sort of design system thinking are really one of my favorite topics to dive into. So I'm really excited to sort of share everything with everyone. So what are we going to talk about specifically? Today, we're going to be going over tools and tips to help iterate and maintain aspects of our design system. This is stuff that either internally we're currently doing, we're in the process of implementing and reviewing, or things that we've been inspired by and we've sort of modified to be custom to ourselves. Once again, we'll share all the references and links to other blog posts and resources that we might have had, but we're going to talk a little bit about organization in our files, versioning some items, documentation, and then obviously everything is involved with about people and process. So we'll discuss some of that as well. But first, if you missed our first presentation, feel free to check it out on YouTube. We've uploaded it. The first talk, we really dive into creating or kicking off your design system, how to plan it out, different team models. The links are available on meetup.com and our website, and also we'll resend them out again afterwards, including this talk when we're all said and done. So let's get started. All right, once your system is built, changes are going to happen. It's inevitable, right? Things are going to evolve. Design is going to change. User feedback is going to come in. Things are going to be in a continual state of flux. There really isn't a state of done in the new product world. This can be hard to do, but hopefully, some of these tips will kind of help keep things clear and help keep things consistent and help manage that change and mitigate some of the risk that's involved with changing, especially if you're moving fast and you're building and you've got a large team. In the first talk, we talked a lot about the design process, discover, design, approval, development, and documentation. While iterating through your design system with this process is super helpful, it's something that we kind of want to keep the whole way through. Even once our design system, we say the first version's out there, we kind of want to keep this process running all the way through. One thing we might add at the tail end, though, is like a change request or feature request or depending on how we're managing our system, a way to keep track of new things that we're not ready to build yet. Adding this layer allows yourself, your team, and stakeholders to add in and keep track of what's going to be coming into the pipeline, into the process, and help you work that into your sprint planning. These items also will, because your design system sprints might not always line up with your product sprints, right? Depending on how your design system team is set up, you might be running a different layer of sprints than the actual product team, and so you want to keep track of that. And just keeping this process all the way through design, all the way through development, and all the way through the entire product lifestyle will just help keep things consistent across the board. Once again, this example is pretty nuanced and pretty scaled in. You don't have to be this detailed. We have more details sort of that on the last talk on different levels of that. But this is just a really good process to get in the habit, and even if you're just a small team and you're working by yourself, it's a good habit just to get into. So that when your team expands or you add more people, that process is just built there and steady. However, coming in this process, how do we manage all those statuses in our files? At any one time, there can be a ton of things in flights. Certain components could be getting updated, certain screens and features can be getting changed, user feedback comes in, and now we're iterating on something new. So one important item for our designers and the design team is to communicate to each other the status of our files and components. And we don't want to be doing that via Slack. Hey, I updated this, or you know, constantly having meetings about what's being updated and whatnot. So there's a few ways to do this. And we want to make sure that it's clear, consistent, and it will help maybe stakeholders and even our development team to see where things are without having too much input from us on a day-to-day basis. One way that we found out that works really well is using emojis. Using emojis in your files to communicate the status of an individual file or component takes a bit of effort, but it really helps out to show stakeholders and other designers where things are. So these are a couple of the emojis that we will put in various places to communicate different statuses. So we'll use the palette to communicate things are in design at the moment. This helps let everyone know that we shouldn't be taking this at final by any means. We'll use the I or ready review. This means design's done, it's ready to be reviewed. It might not be slated for development or anything else yet, but we just want to signify that we are done designing it. We can start getting some feedback on it. Green check mark, pretty self-explanatory. Means we got okay from the stakeholders and it's ready to be handed off to developers. This can be, like I said, at a component level, screen level. So we want to make sure we communicate that there. The ghost or tombstone or coffin, depending on where you want to go with it. We don't use this a ton, but we tend to use it a lot more for depreciating assets. So let's say we built out a component and we built out a new version of it that's like lighter weight for memory reasons. We might put this in the legacy component because we don't want to pull it out of the system yet, but we want to tell people, hey, be careful if you're using this, it might go away. Sort of the blue swirl. We'll use that for in development. That'll just let designers know that this screen or this component is in the pipeline right now. So it might be planned for a sprint. It's being developed out. Let's not make any changes to it or be very careful if we're going to. P for deployed and live, published. That means it's live on the website. Folder, obviously for archived files, and then X is do not use. Usually what we'll do is we'll take the ghost, keep it in there for a couple of weeks, and then we'll put the red X over the top to say, hey, this thing's gonna be deleted like next week, please don't use it. So we use the emojis mostly in the names. So putting them in the names of our different frames. So we're going to be using Figma. We'll be talking Figma primarily, but all of this should apply to Sketch and Adobe XD. So here is an example where we actually put the emojis in the names of the frame so that we can see them in the layer menu. So for example, this is kind of how we would structure a design file, login screen, subscreens below it, using sort of this naming convention that we kind of use in-house. In each one of these, we know from just glancing at the layer menu what status it's in, and if somebody's working on it, we'll know that. If it's in design, we know some are in review, we know something's been approved, we know something's already been developed or in development right now. So we can easily see that just from the layer menu on Figma, which is super helpful. It's also super helpful because it's on top of your frame automatically. So if you're using your frames for all your screens, putting these inside on top of the frame will communicate that status really easily because you can see it in the frame. It does not show up if it's nested within another frame, so it's one caveat, but just a way to communicate the status of this individual element in the layer directory or layer folder structure, and then also outside here in the artboard space. We'll also use these statuses to communicate on the cover of each file. So in Figma, they allow you to, the first page of your file, they use as sort of a snapshot or as a cover. And we'll create custom covers, and we'll kind of go through some of that later on and what we tend to put on there. But we'll use that to communicate the status on certain things. So if we're creating a prototype file and it's ready for review, we'll switch that on in the cover and use that. And that's super beneficial. So you can get a quick glance on where all your files are, what the status of everything is, and where they are. Now, putting the emojis can be a very manual process. And I know it's not for everyone. And in fact, we've even talked about not doing it as much anymore until someone builds a plugin that can do that for us, or we build it ourselves. But one thing that we've found out, or we've seen recently, is status annotation. And we've been sort of potentially migrating to this. We've been using it on a lot of projects just to get into the flow and get into the practice. And what this does, it adds a little floating card above your frame. So you can't really do this with the name adjustments like you would with the emoji, but these little cards will still show up above your frames. It doesn't actually change the name. I mean, you can do both, so that's a possibility. But this plugin does it automatically. You can select multiple frames and easily drop in a status for your frame. An example is like this. So you bring up your plugin. They're canned statuses. You can't edit the statuses, so you can't make your own. So you got in progress, review, approve, develop, complete, and archive. And what it does is it'll add a little tag above the frame. If you move your frame around, you can hit reset and that'll fall through. So if your developers or your stakeholders are viewing your files, not in prototype mode, but in the actual create mode, they'll be able to see the status of all these frames, which is kind of nice. Another thing you can do as well, instead of having it float above the frame, you can always bring it within the frame, so then it's visible on the prototype file as well. So all of these are different ways to sort of communicate the status at an individual frame level or an individual component level by just leveraging emojis in the names or little cards that are floating above your frames or inside it. We find this really important because it sets up everybody on the same playing field when they know, when they're deciding what's done, what isn't done. And it's actually helped us quite a bit on a lot of our projects to help just keep things very consistent. Communicate without having somebody to ping you, hey, which one of these frames is done? What can I start developing on? If project managers involved, they know what they can grab and start getting requirements together and whatnot without getting us involved ahead of time. The big thing is just to talk with your team ahead of time. If you're going to go the emoji route, make sure you have a place to sort of keep those in a central repository. We use Notion to sort of house where all of ours are and what they mean. And while working, usually keep that open to copy and paste those in there as I need them. So the next thing we're going to talk about is version history. So like, when should we version? How do we version? Normally, you might want to version after a major release or a major feature push. It's really up to you and how you want to handle your file versioning. Now, there is no hard versioning or source control like Abstract is for Sketch. Figma has sort of their own loose versioning system, and we'll kind of talk a couple of tips on how you could use that as well. But if your system is set up where prototypes are the lowest level of your design file, and your design files act as like a library of assets being brought into your prototype files, versioning actually becomes really manageable. And this will allow us to have multiple versions of components and selectively sync items as needed in our prototype files. There's a lot of great benefits to keeping historical versions. One, making a case study and you want to have all your old version files to get screenshots and screen grabs. Or there might be a design that you built 6 months ago that you want to revisit and do maybe an A/B test on it to see if we actually improved or not. So versioning is something that we might not normally think of as something super critical for us to do, and especially in the world of everything being super connected and updating on the fly all the time with Figma and linked libraries. So this is a little bit of a manual process, but I think it's beneficial for us as a design team, and it'll help if we are on the same level with our development team and maybe any stakeholders, so they know this is how we're going to handle our versioning system. So the first version is page-based versioning. This is one way to manage a version right in the file itself. This is nice because you can see all of your versions in a single file. Word of warning though, is if you're using a design library and you're pulling in components from a different file, you are gonna have to be very explicit about making a second component if you're making changes to a said component. Because if I have a component, let's say I have a input field on Bird's Eye Login Experience V1 and I updated it for V2, if I just pull that component in, because I just edited that source component, it's going to overwrite it on both pages. So a little bit of word of warning if you're using a single file or doing page-based versioning. Now, one thing you could do is break apart or deconstruct all of your screens in your other files, but that is a little bit of effort. Page-based versioning is something that we might do in like an exploration phase. If we're early on in a project and we're doing some explorations of what the interface may look like, we might do this internally for different milestones when we haven't quite yet established our design system or figured out exactly what the system is going to look like, because we're still exploring that. So this might be where we do that type of versioning. The other type of versioning, which we tend to use a lot more, is new file versioning. So this is similar to page-based. However, we're pulling out a new file essentially. So this works really well if you have a multi-level UI kit, and this is kind of an example of what like a multi-level UI kit might look like on a project. Right? We might have a file that drives our colors, our shadows, type styles, and maybe different layer styles. We might have another file that drives brand logos or brand assets and maybe avatars, and another file that might be our icon library, and those will all get consumed by our core UI kit file, and that'll house like our inputs, our buttons, everything like that. And down below then might be our smaller design files. These could be product specific, or here they're different platforms. So Shipwright Mobile, responsive web, TV, auto, and then underneath that would be our actual design file. Your UI kit doesn't have to be this nuanced. You don't need this many linked connections. This is sort of the most abstracted version of a multi-tiered UI kit, at least that we would probably be comfortable with. You could probably go even crazier in this, but just something that you may see. So if we're doing new file versioning, normally what we would do is in our mobile product design file, that would also be a library. And that library would house most of the components that are driving our prototypes. So normally when we release, let's say we finished a sprint, we finished a release, and we're ready to start up our new version, we'll take our prototype files and we will make a duplication and make the next version of that file, essentially allowing that other file to just live in time. That way, with our design file acting as a library, a lot of the changes in there would be component based, and then most of our big screen changes would be down to these individual files. The nice thing about doing these is once you duplicate your file and you just start building off, you don't ever have to worry about your old version. Just don't ever update it, and it'll be stuck in time essentially forever. One word of warning though, if for some reason your mobile product design file, you want to version that, and that is a library, at least in Figma, if you duplicate that and you want to start using that as the new library file, you're gonna have to change all the links on all the files below, because you can't change the master yet. So at least that's something that we're not aware of. So just a word of caution if you're doing that. Another thing that we might do, and this is the most common type of versioning we do in our design system files, is component versioning. So when we're building our new component and you still have some legacy ones that might be some live and some old designs, this is just a way that we might manage it. We'll add, like I said, a coffin, a tombstone, a ghost emoji to maybe the name of the component. Another thing is we might also put an overlay asset. So might have a gridded texture that says, we're getting rid of this. So if somebody brings it in, they can see that right away, or it shows up in their library. If a developer sees that, they can ask a question, say, hey, where's the new one here? I saw in this design, it's using the old one. We also might change its color to something that's outside of the design system. So let's say our whole site is white and orange, and we're gonna change it to like, I don't know, bright red with green, just so everyone can see that it doesn't belong. So that's a way that we might have those legacy elements in there, and everyone knows that those are eventually going to be depreciated. Here we've also put them in a legacy folder. So then when we go and we look at text input, it shows up in the legacy folder. And so people will know, hey, if I see these, just go change them to the non-legacy ones, which really helps when you have a team of designers and you're managing the design system, or as a team, you're managing the design system. If someone rolls out a legacy component with a coffin, anytime somebody sees that, they should be able to just switch that over immediately in their file and bring in the new one with little to no effort, and doesn't cause a big ripple effect. Now, like I said, Figma has its own version history in the files. While it's not super great, you can still save off versions and come back to them at a later point. It does have this auto save. So it auto saves all the time, which is sort of fantastic. But it's hard to, because everything's housed in that single file, it's hard to like have to go back a bunch of versions to go see something and then go back into the future when you're done. It just takes a lot of time. There's a lot of loading involved. However, this could be helpful if you need to roll something back, or is a good supplementary practice to maybe file versioning. So when you're done with a file, add your own custom version marker in there like we would here. So V1 released version, sprint deaded in 5.15. We would mark that in time so that we would know that. So if any changes, let's say we rolled in some new design components into that file, we could go back and easily change that one out. It would show up like this as an example. Here's what the version history looks like. One time this did save us tremendously. We had accidentally broken all the inputs in our design system and published them out across an entire project, which was crazy because every single input got reset. So all your customizations got reset. And we were able to go into our design system version history, pull up the old version, basically say this is the new, this is current, and then push that back out and everything fixed itself. So we're able to revert that change by using the Figma version history, which has been really nice. So it's like I wouldn't solely rely on it, but it's definitely a nice complementary system to maybe some more manual versioning. Now we've got a really good podcast. Design Details did a really good podcast on how they think about versioning their files. And this blog post is really interesting on versioning design systems in Figma. So we'll have links to both of those. So definitely take a look at those. There's tons of strategies on how to version your files and how to keep sort of that legacy items around. So this is definitely something that you know, we're going to be continually iterating on, and we're always looking for how other people are doing it. So, all right, cool. So documentation. I know we talked a little bit about different areas we could do documentation in the last talk, but documentation and communication are, like, in my mind, some of the most important things when it comes to managing and iterating through our design system. We talked about some documentation already, just by putting emojis in files and properly versioning your files. That's a level of documentation. How do we communicate to the rest of our team where requirements might be or how things might change? So we're going to talk a little bit about how we manage documentation in various aspects, and then we'll touch lightly on a couple of tools just to kind of reiterate some that we've used or have thought about using. So a lot of our documentation actually happens in Figma. There's a few things that can really just help communicate details to developers or to stakeholders. We've already talked about, like I said, putting emojis in the name can help communicate status, but how else can we provide a sense of clarity on our project? One of those things is, for example, here we might have some red line information in the design system in a card that we've created for some components. So that's a way for us to communicate to developers, hey, here's a couple of rules. This is how this might work in a way right in Figma. So when they're looking at the components, the details are right there. The other thing we talked about is cover cards. Having cover cards can easily help identify files. Naming your files correctly is always super important, but these cover cards can communicate status, stakeholders, maybe who the primary designer is on it, what version they are. A couple of things that are important to us, you know, obviously title, what type of file it is, we'll put that name on there. We might even change the color of the background to communicate the type of file. So we might use a darker blue for design system files. And then for our prototype files, maybe like an orange so they really stand out. We might, like I said, put stakeholders who's signing off on these files. We might communicate that in there on the cover. Obviously, status is super important. If there's a team of designers and they're responsible for different areas, we might put the designers' names on the files as well. So they know if somebody's looking at it, they can say easily identify who's working on it, who's working on, and be able to talk to them if they have any issues. Sometimes we'll even pull in our company portraits and put them on there. So you can really, there's a lot of great cover card examples out there. I'm sure Sketch and Adobe XD do something similar, but Figma, this is just the first file in your pages, or the first page in your page listing. We usually call it _cover or just cover, and put this templated piece that we've built out in there so it'll capture that. Another thing is creating notation elements. So we've created a series of items in our design system that we call the Design System Management System. It's a super catchy name, but these are a bunch of like components that allow us to essentially put tooltips or arrows or movement notification, like all the things that we might have to communicate, like how things might move, or put text there, or a little tooltip to explain where some data is. We've created a bunch of assets that we can drop in the files to help communicate different things. So here we're talking about messages and alerts, but we might communicate something else at the top of the file differently. These like droppable notes really help us organize our files in a way that's like super digestible for everyone, even including them in the frame sometimes. So on a prototype, they may show up. One thing that we've thought about a lot is even putting a little icon down in the bottom of a frame that if you hover over it, we can link up all the tooltips with a nice slick overlay in the prototype so that someone can get all their notes if they want to. One of the most critical things, which just happened, I would say in the last month, maybe I'm off, is Figma now allows you to put external links in text fields. So this is a super excellent way to link to either documentation, requirements, stories, Jira tasks, like whatever. So you can link from Figma basically to anywhere. And then from wherever you're housing your requirements or other documentation, you could link back into Figma and sort of create that consistent loop and keep everyone informed where everything's located. This has been super helpful when we're creating a component and we have multiple development stories live for that component. And I need to like find those stories and maybe leave some notes or find some things. I can add them all in here so then I can use that as a reference to go there. Or if a developer is looking at a screen and they have some data requirements, I can link the requirements in a little tooltip card. So while they're looking at the screen, they have access to the requirements as a quick link. They don't have to go search and find it. So a little bit of a manual process, but it is very beneficial to have this stuff because we tend to use or try to keep comments for like things that need to be updated or things that need to be done. So that's it for sort of ways we document in Figma. Another place to put some documentation is Notion. We're big Notion fans. We normally expand on more detailed information in Notion, however. So we might work with our development team on how we want to build out that documentation, but here's where we might write up like system-wide patterns or data requirements. And those are kind of the two examples that we're gonna go through is how we might think about putting that stuff together. So it's really good to communicate patterns in a central way. It might not be obvious in our design tool how something may work, especially if somebody's not clicking on a prototype to see the interactions. It might not be super intuitive with a bunch of frames all over the place on how a pattern that might be across the entire system works. So you can illustrate these things through the written word like we did here. And so those can be in your design documentation. Here's these patterns. This is how everything's going to work. And that's one way to do it. Another way to do it is spinning up what we call like gray boxed animations. So these are navigation examples that we communicate some ideas that might roll out through the entire system. So this would be something that we might have done early on in a project. We settled on it as a team. we roll it out. We'll either have that maybe as a prototype or an animated GIF right in the documentation so somebody can see that. We feel system patterns, navigation patterns, all of that stuff is really important to have sort of a solid foundation in documentation with your development team, so everyone knows, nobody's asking how does something work 6 months down the road, or if they are, it's very clear and concise and where it is. Data is also a big documentation piece that we end up doing quite a bit of on the design team. So documenting your data and your maybe data structure is super helpful. We're big believers in using the Google Sheet data import plugin. So working with your development team or data team to get sort of that real data and that real structure in place will help a ton. If we're working solo, we might use, then we kind of do what we call contextual data. And that's where we're just trying to make it look as real as we possibly can. There's a really good plugin called Content Reel that'll pull data in, but I'm a bigger fan of the Google spreadsheet method because I don't know, feels a little bit more authentic. And if you get an export from like, let's say a client or a data team, you can easily copy and paste that right into your Figma files. But documenting out how that stuff should look and work and everything like that, and what it is super important. Like I said, we use Google Sheet Sync for just about all of our data in our files. So we try really hard to make sure it matches what our dev team is doing as much as possible. So this is super beneficial. They have a really good method on bringing in all kinds of data styles. You can do a bunch of calculations in Google Sheets if you need to. You can even work with, we've got some random generator plugins that we found for Google Sheets to help us generate some stuff if we have to. But this will really help import data into your templates. But the big thing is like writing what it is and how does it work in your documentation, or maybe what its purpose is. So we have two types of data structures we might work with our development team to create out, and sort of, like I said, contextual data. This is a structure where we're taking elements that are really near to each other in a design, a page, or a data table, and we're just putting them in a single sheet. For example, we might have some user data, their employer data, all mixed together for a single table view or a card element. Here we're showing what the variables are and what the output might be. This is just an idea of like what it finally should look like. We might also add another column of where this may be sourced, or if there's any graphic assets along with it. So like, let's say we have an avatar in a data field. But this has been really helpful for, you know, like if your QA team or your dev team is looking at designs and they're going, what were you intending to be on here? Having this stuff written out and explained out in your documentation is super beneficial. If you get time to work with your dev team, this is what we call sort of relevant data. So this data structure might take a little bit more upfront work with your team, but the goal is to build a data model with your development team, so you can be a little lighter on the documentation because they're building the same thing you are. So in this example above, we might take the data that's relevant to the employer, and that might be its own page in Google Sheets, opposed to the user data, which might be its own page. So single element might be pulling in variables from multiple sheets, which could be something closer to how it actually might be built, and it might not be. This is just kind of two different ways for us to think about capturing that information and the way we need to communicate it out to our team. Our design team does spend a little bit of time writing up requirements, whether it be patterns, system-wide, or like a specific screen, just so we can help on communicating our intentions, our thoughts behind things, and making sure that a lot of that stuff's clear. And it's super helpful if you're coming back to a design that you did maybe 3-4 months ago, just to give yourself a refresher of what you were thinking. What was this intended? What did this spark line mean? What did this chart communicate? What were the values in here, and how does it all add up? So it's really helpful for that. Now, you can always document right into a coded system as well, right? So if you have a live coded system, or your design system has a microsite, a lot of larger enterprise design systems will do this. So this is like Sprout Social. They have their patterns and how their different patterns work right in their microsite. You can get into how their forms look, how the date pickers look, all of that stuff right from here. Things like material, Google's material UI, you can see that. They have all of their documentation right in the live coded site. Microsoft's Fluent Design Systems, similar way. So this is really nice because the live coded elements are sitting right next to the documentation, and that's super, super helpful. And like we said in our last talk, leveraging Zero Height and Storybook, you can have the live coded elements, the documentation, and the Figma all right next to each other. So it really comes down to what your team, what works for your team. There's a lot of tools out there, and I wouldn't say like any one of these is the end all be all, but there's a lot of different things that you can do and try just to kind of experiment with your team, come to a good consensus. And if something isn't working, feel free to try something else. The last part is people and process, which really is only one big thing when it comes to design systems that I feel is really important in the process aspect. And it's when working through our design system, it's good to have a monthly or even an every other week check-in with the entire design system team. So a lot of times you might go your own separate ways for a couple of days, but it's always good to come back in and say, hey, these have changed on the static system. We need to get these coded up in the live system. You can even plan out design sprints in these meetings because they might be different than the project sprints. So setting aside a bit of time each week to maintain and just work on your system independently of maybe other feature work is really important. So having that design system team where you're sitting down working with your front end team and you're working with maybe whoever's the product owner to kind of go over that if you can is super beneficial. And then also setting up a little bit of time just for yourself to kind of maintain and continually evolve your design system. You're gonna build things and build components smarter, better, faster. The longer you're in your design system, and you might want to go back and adjust some other things, right? So we're always continually maintaining our design system and thinking about how we can keep it alive and give it all the care that it needs. So at some point, something doesn't get busted or something doesn't work and becomes just a burden to use. And that can be reorganizing things if needed. Having that time, for example, auto layout came out in the midst of a design system build, and slowly rolling that out over time really helped us sort of build in some default responsiveness on a bunch of our design files now that we didn't have, and we rolled that out pretty easily by building out some new components and just while we were in the files updating and kind of iterating through those. So that monthly check-in and just setting some time aside is super, super beneficial. But there is no silver bullet. There is no one size solution that fits all. These are mostly ideas that we found to be super helpful, things that we've found out in the design community or things that we've tried and iterated on our own. We're always looking for more about design systems and how others are managing their design systems. So we're always trying to find what's the best way to do things, and then how do we customize it so it's the best way for us to do, because something that might work for one team might not necessarily work for the other team. Like I said before, we have the links for everything that we kind of talked about. So we have like Shipwright UI Kit, Storybook, Zero Height Notion, a link to our first talk, the status annotation plugin, Google Sheet Sync, and then the podcast of versioning and handoff podcast, and versioning design systems blog post. Also, quick plug for our Shipwright UI Kit. This is out live on the Figma community. We'd love if you download it and you have any feedback or questions, let us know. We'll be pushing out more stuff to it pretty soon, hopefully. We've got some new changes and improvements for that, so we're excited to push that out. So, and thank you everyone for listening.
Awesome, thanks, Billy. All right, so does anybody have any questions? You can throw them in the Q&A. We actually do have one question from YouTube. Riley asks, when When do you use your notation elements versus the built-in comments with Figma?
So we tend to use Figma comments internally as things that need to be changed or adjusted. So if we're working with a team and we got to change a label and we got to adjust some padding, or we don't like this local grouping spacing of elements, we use comments for that because comments can be resolved. If Figma added sort of Envision tour points, so Envision has these things called tour points where you can essentially create a linked story of things. We could see using those. So we would use our notation elements for requirements, links to documentation, links to maybe a user interview. So if like, hey, this is what we designed, here's the user interview, or here's the Google slide on the user research for why we designed that, we would use our notation elements for that, or redlining type stuff, or some high level notes. And then we'll reserve our comments for like tasks that might need to be done. So if like a design review is happening, we might be in the prototype dropping comments all over the place to keep those changes, so we don't have to keep two lists essentially.
Yeah, there's a question here from Shabank. There's clear engineering and design collaboration in design systems, but do you guys also collaborate with product managers? What does that look like?
Yeah, we do. So depending on the project, if we have a product manager, a lot of times the project manager might not necessarily be diving too much into the design system, but it's important to communicate with that product manager that we need the time allocated to work on that and to iterate on that, so they can maybe plan that into sort of what they're thinking is going to be done, or things that are going to be completed. So a lot of times, it's just making sure that they know, like, the status is super important to communicate with them. Or if we're building out prototype files for like a usability test for a product manager might be running, or a UX researcher is running. So making sure that they're part of the design system team enough that they are aware or help create that status and sort of management system that you might overlay over the top, just so everyone's on the same page.
Good. And then we have one from Luis here. Hello, is there a tool to build a microsite like Salesforce Design System, or is it built with HTML and CSS?
I mean, Storybook is probably the best out of the box solution for stuff like that, but it's still a lot of manually coding all the elements up. Zero Height will allow you to embed individual frames, so you could embed all your components, but they wouldn't be like live coded components. I could see someone doing one in Webflow. We've been using that for a little bit. Yeah. Which is a little bit more of a visual editor, so you could build quite a bit of stuff in there, I think.
One more from Andre. Do you have a development library, for example, React-based library, together with the design libraries in Figma? If so, do you keep the versioning of these libraries in sync for major and minor releases?
So we usually start, so if we're going to use let's say we're using Material UI on a project, we'll usually have a discussion and do sort of an analysis early on to see what are things that they already do, what can we leverage, what do we want to change or override, or have our development team build out custom. So we'll kind of have that conversation early on, and then we'll bring in our UI kit and customize it accordingly, instead of bringing like a Material UI kit in and then adjusting that one, because there's just the way we name things and the way we do things, it's a lot of extra work. But we'll always have that conversation with the development team if we're choosing one. So for example, we chose Material UI on a project, and early on we talked to the development team, and they're like, well, input fields work this very specific way. It'd be a lot of work to do these little things. Can we just make them work this way? Or the typographic scale is already this. Can you make your design fit in that? And so we'll just kind of keep that in the back of our mind the whole time, and maybe bring that small component in, and then override that in our UI kit to make it be as similar as possible.
Another one here from Shabank. Could you talk a bit more about tooltips and how incorporating tooltips documentation within Figma? You mentioned an overlay effect via a prototype.
Yeah, so we've done this on a lot of prototypes where sort of your prototype starts at like a table of contents, and that table of contents might link to a bunch of frames. And then within those frames, we might put a back to table of contents icon down at the bottom to bring us back to the table of contents, and that might be in every single frame. So another thing that we've thought about doing is if we had a bunch of tooltips in a sort of an overlay, so in a prototype we could set it as an overlay, we could do a hover state over a item that said display tooltips, and then when you hover over that, then all the tooltips would hover over. So that's something that you could do in Figma pretty easily, I think. That could display all the details and information for whatever you're trying to communicate.
Question here from Jamie. Could you explain more about how you document design tokens and hand this off to developers?
So a lot of times we'll talk with our dev team early on about that. So like if they have a specific naming convention or there's certain things that we want to use and keep that consistent, we might then subvert how we would normally name things to keep it the way that they want to. So for example, like we were just looking at Sprout Social and we were looking at their design token system and the way they break out different padding tokens and everything like that. So that inspired us to create a couple of padding elements named very similar as an example, just to kind of test it out so that we could keep that consistent across the board. So when our dev team uses those and in Figma, we're using those to adjust all our input paddings. So across the board, everything would be exactly the same. We would still have to manually communicate if there was adjustments to those. I mean, you might be able, there might be a way to make that even more automated, so we don't have to communicate anything at some point.
Yeah, I think there's one other edge case that we're seeing too, Jamie, is that teams that are moving to design tokens and design systems from a previously disparate system where nothing talked to each other. So a lot of times that's, you know, not so much handing off with developers right away, but getting brand standards set, excuse me, at the highest level, and then being able to start documenting those and carrying those forward into. I think Billy has another good post on our site about multi-tiered UI kits in Figma, and so that talks a little bit about how you would structure design tokens at the highest level, and then parent that through each one of your design libraries that, you know, is maybe platform specific. One here from Ian. Hi, are you guys doing any A/B testing on specific patterns? If so, is that impacting the process for your design system?
So since our prototype files are the lowest level of our design system, we can make multiple versions of components to A/B test, or multiple versions of screens in our design file, bring those into those prototype files, and we can easily do an A/B test that way, because both of those files can be independent. And then when we're done with the A/B tests, whatever we decided to keep can be finalized and kept in the design system, and we might go forward with that file, and then we can delete out any components that we're no longer using from the other test. But the other test would still be archived in time, because Figma will keep deleted components in the files that they're being used, and they'll allow you to restore them if you want to. So A/B testing, I don't think, throws too much of a wrench into the overall process, as long as we know early enough that we're going to do it, and then we can plan for it. It does take a little bit of extra time, because you're designing maybe everything in your design file and then using that as a library out to 2 different prototype files. But I think with enough of enough runway on that, it should be pretty manageable.
Yeah, kind of answering one of Shabank's follow-up questions there, but expanding on Ian's question, what does your user research, usability testing, and validation in regards to the design system look like? Maybe like segueing that into, how are you measuring success for your design system? What are some metrics? For example, designers using it, are your products more consistent, et cetera?
So one of the cool things We haven't had a chance to use it yet, but Figma actually, if you are an enterprise account holder, they will show you statistics for your design system. So that's a real easy way to see the adoption. Our design team is pretty small, and we've all fully drank the design system Kool-Aid. So we're all kind of using it, and we're all kind of getting ideas and kind of working through it. But I think using that Figma enterprise system, being able to see those statistics of what components are being used, what one isn't being used, will definitely help a lot. And then on the development side, finding something similar to measure what's being used, what's being just done in line, or what's being changed or adjusted, I think is super, super beneficial. If you're early on in a project and the team is a little bit smaller, and you're able to work with like the development team early on to build out that live coded design system, you can guarantee a certain amount of adoption. But I think the success comes in is it not being solely the designer's responsibility, but having different stakeholders on the design system team. So I think that's where that success metric can come, because you'll have ambassadors from different areas in the company or on the product.
Yeah, you'll also see like a big advantage is just time to market for new prototypes or new features that get requested. Really just crafting using the toolkit you have in the design system, and then development should be a lot more expedient as well. So you should see, if you're running Scrum, you should see an increased velocity if your team's using it right, or maybe not true end velocity, but maybe your ability to run multiple prototype tests and usability tests will increase. So there's a few different tangential metrics that you can take a look through. I think the most tangible one being how fast are we able to test new ideas, how fast are we able to rebound from an interview session to the next interview session, what does that turnaround time look like? In the past, for us, it was like using, well, Sketch with design libraries, obviously that sped it up quite a bit. But you're going from days to potentially even one day, or switching things from a morning to an afternoon between usability tests, just with the power of the system together. One other question from Shivank: how do you handle new requests? Do you open tickets or something else? Sorry if you went over this one already.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, so we'll normally we'll create, like I said, the design team or the design system team might have their own like Asana board or Trello board to manage the work that's being done in the design system, or things, especially if we're like a federated design team and things had to be promoted into the design system, just a way so somebody can self-manage that to keep everyone aware of what's changing. But yeah, I think, yeah, keeping some sort of using some sort of task management tool to keep a list of changes that need to go into the system or that are coming, so people can just grab them and implement them. For example, our Shipwright UI kit, we're using Asana for all of that right now. And we just have a list of tasks in there that anyone can grab and sort of develop out what needs to be done. But yeah, sort of following that process, the sort of discover, design, get approval, develop, and document, that process all the way through, and whatever tool you're using will be super beneficial. And then, like I said, adding maybe one more that's like feature requests or changes, depending on how your design system team or just your team is laid out.
Yeah, one kind of related to that, but more about production from Chad. He's curious how you handle bugs in a live environment and how those bug changes downflow through all the beta/test versions that are being built. In small teams, this is pretty simple, but on larger teams, maybe not.
Yeah, so on larger teams, usually, like I said, hopefully we've gotten a lot of the smaller issues resolved early on if we can work with our development team to help build out the design system or the live coded system. Now, there's always going to be issues that come up and bugs that come up. Hopefully design is involved, or the part of the design system team is involved in the QA process. And they're taking a look at everything and logging bugs in whatever system their bugs are being logged in. So on some of our projects, that might be logging things to Jira. So every once in a while, taking some time at maybe in the middle of a sprint, and using your design system time to sit down, run through the front end, take a look at issues that might come up, and logging mostly we'll try to stick as designers, we'll try to write only design specific issues, especially if we're working with a QA, and we have QA team doing like a lot more of the more difficult stuff. And sometimes we'll even pair with the QA team to talk through things that we might, we might not have seen early on, or they have questions on, and is got all through the checks, but then they're the final ones, and it might not be super clear. So we'll work on making those changes there. And logging those into whatever tool we're using to manage those changes.
That's all the questions we have. Unless anyone has any others, can wait a moment if that spurred any more.
Silence.
Awesome.
Nada.
Stopping the share.
Oh, one more.
Oh, we got one more.
From Andre, what are the benefits and downsides of keeping the icons in a separate file / library?
So benefit of having all your icons in their own library is if you ever switch icon libraries for whatever reason, let's say you pulled in Font Awesome for some reason, or like you bought Bud icons and you're using those, having those in their own file. And then all of a sudden someone says, hey, we're changing all the icons. We don't like these rounded corners. We want hard edges. You can either pull in another library and bring that in, and you can just replace all those and keeping them off in that own file. Which is, in my mind, keeps it a lot cleaner. You can organize your icons by pages instead of having them sort of in your design system taking up a ton of space. So I personally feel there's a lot more pros. I guess the con is you do have to go to another file and you have one more dependency to push down when changes do happen, which is always kind of one of the downsides of an abstracted design system or a multi-tiered UI kit. But I think just like the organization side of it is beneficial, especially if you have a project that ends up having like a lot of icons. So.
One more from Ian. How old is your current design system in Figma?
The project I'm on now is going on almost 2 years. Will it be 2 years in September? Yeah. So the design system is 2 years old, and it has gone from being in a single file to abstracted out to multiple files because we actually exceeded the memory limit of Figma, which is 2 gigs per file. So that's where we started thinking about abstracting things out, and it needs to serve multiple products. So we had to really think about how those multiple products were handled and how nuances in those products were different.
Sounds good. Jacob, that's all we got.
Awesome. Thanks, Billy and Andrew. That was great.
One more.
One more?
Are there any
Okay.
books and additional resources you can recommend on design systems? I think Jacob sent out a few examples of stuff that we've created. Billy, are there any other ones that you didn't mention that would be helpful?
I still think like Brad Frost's book, Atomic Design, is like the most important book. It's like the foundation of building good design systems, and really thinking about inheritance and the way things are structured and building those proper foundations. Like, I think that is the most important thing to read. Otherwise, Design Systems, I think it's just called Design Systems by Envision, is a good read on how to manage design systems and think about design systems. So that's a good ebook to download. I'm sure there's a couple. There's a ton of really good blog posts by, his name's escaping me, Curtis. We'll send them to Jacob and we'll put it on the recap. Who's got a bunch of really good articles that we've used as inspiration for just managing design systems, managing the creation process, and thinking about how the process should flow from start to end.
All right. I think is that it? Is it real this time?
That's
No
it.
more questions?
There are
Okay.
no more.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks Billy, thanks Andrew, and thanks everyone for asking all the questions. It's always great we just never know what help people need beyond what we assume, when we make these presentations. So it's always great to have the Q&A. everyone on YouTube that's watching, thanks for watching from YouTube. Thanks for tuning in. It's been great having you as well. Next month we have on June 23rd, I believe. Yeah, we're going to have a product design portfolio review. So if you're, looking to get feedback on your portfolio, whether it's on your website or like you're setting up resumes or whatever, we're going to have that event next month. We're still buttoning up the details on registration, but we'll follow up in an email with a link to that for all of you, so you don't have to worry about hunting it down. But we'll also have like a type form that you can enter and say, hey, this is what I would like feedback on. Here's a link to my portfolio, and then we can kind of put you in a list, because if we have 50 people submitting their portfolios to get reviewed, we can't do all of that. So kind of first come first serve, but it'll be cool to still share those in real time with people and see how we kind of look at certain things within portfolios and what we value at Headway. So I don't know if Andrew or Billy, if you want to comment on that at all, or.
Yeah, no comments on that specifically. I mean, I guess kind of timely, we are looking for product designers to join our team, senior and kind of mid-level product designers. So if you are interested, go to our site, headway.io/careers. And if you're interested in just getting your portfolio looked at too, and you're not quite on the market yet looking for something, yeah, submit, and would love to give some feedback and some thoughts next month.
Awesome. Yeah, and we also have another event series that we do called React.js Green Bay. So if you're a React developer and interested in any of that, or just kind of curious about React development, we have that as well every month. Next month we have Paris Chandler of Black Tech Pipeline is going to be talking about theming Gatsby apps with theme UI. So that should be pretty cool. Should be presenting from the East Coast. So she'll be one of our first kind of like big or fully remote presenters, because usually we have folks in our office come in and present. So it'll be a good time. So yeah, if you're interested in development, React.js Green Bay, it's on headway.io on our website there. And we'll be sending out updates on future events via email to all you folks. So thanks again for being here. And if you have any questions, shoot us an email. You can just reply to those emails that we send out. I'll be able to answer any of those questions and get you connected. So thanks again for joining us, and take care, everybody.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Have a good